DD might be a 2-button playstyle, but the Ignite Elementalist can actually circumvent that issue by making use of the defiled forces. With this, our Arcanist Brand is going to refresh our Ignite over and over again, giving us huge freedom in terms of movement for bosses and actually completely getting rid of the 2-button playstyle. In comparison to that, the Necro DD version is actually hit-based, which forces you to stand still on bosses, which in turn is going to make you a little bit more susceptible to dying when it comes to these Uber bosses. Of course, you are that little bit more tanky, but you cannot get rid of the 2-button playstyle that you need because you always need to desecrate, DD, desecrate, and so on and so forth to actually get your damage onto the target. In addition to that, you also need the Transfigure gem Detonate Dead of Chain Reaction, which especially early on is going to either force you to run labs over and over again or buy that gem for a lot of currency on the trade side. And comparing this to the Cast on Crit version that also recently came up, you also have the problem there that you need the Transfigured version of Chain Reaction, and on top of that, Cast on Crit usually starts ramping very, very late because, as the name implies, you need to crit to actually start getting your damage onto the target, and naturally at the start of a league, the crit portion of your character is not as high. On top of that, you also need a 5-link for the Cast on Crit version, basically making this a very late game oriented setup, which again is completely circumvented if you go Ignite Elementalist. The link to the POB will obviously be down in the description and also in the pinned comment below, but please make sure to go through the notes at first so you can get a good understanding of what is actually going on. There is a lot of general info here, as well as regex, leveling filter from Gucci Pradas, and also something that you need to do after you're swapping to DD. Namely, you need to include at least the Kitava's Herald in your Desecrate Corpse pool. To do this, you will need a Raise Spectre Gem level 1, or there's also more information on this if you want more min-max actually here in this orange section right here with a Reddit post explaining more options in detail, but this version right here is absolutely enough to get started. You are going to use your Raise Spectre Gem right here, and you will now go into the Act 5 Cathedral Rooftop right here, which I already did. You are going to cast your Desecrate until you can find a Kitava Herald by pressing and holding your A key for the corpse targeting. As you can see here, this is a Kitava Herald. Now I'm going to use my Raise Spectre right here. Now I have the Kitava Herald here. I go back to my hideout, and as soon as we are here, we are going to unequip the Raise Spectre, use whatever we used there before, and now we're going to check if our Desecrate is going to have the Kitava Herald by holding the corpse targeting, and as you can see here, the Desecrate now has the Kitava Herald in its corpse pool. I also created the items to actually give you crafting tips for the end game. As you can see here, the items are not going to be named like this in game, but I'm giving you crafting tips to get to that end game version way quicker. For example, for the weapon right here, you are going to start out with a Misery Essence until you hit the cast speed and the damage over time multiplier. Then you're going to multi-mod the item, and then you're going to craft the 2 additional affixes on there. And there's also more stuff like the fractured bases and also veiled stuff. As you can see here, it's all color coded for you. So definitely take a look into here if you are moving from your mid-game setup to your end-game setup. Obviously, this is also for the mapping version, where you can just take a look and actually know instantly how to craft your own stuff. When you're going through the build, it's also really important that you are having the same correct skill set to the items and also to the skill tree. For example, right here, we do have a leveling 1 to 22 or leveling 2, 22 to 33, and so on and so forth. And corresponding to that, I also have a skill setup for this. for example, 1 to 28. So if you are reaching mid-game, it's really important that you put your skill set on mid-game, your items on mid-game, and also your tree right here on mid-game, so that you are comparing and using all the same things, so you are not getting warnings after warnings all the time. We are going to be leveling with Rolling Magma, and it's really important to understand, especially for the early game portion of the build, that I have put stuff in priority sorted from top to bottom. So if you only have 2 blues, then you're going to use Rolling Magma together with Combustion. If you have 3, it also adds Elemental Prolife, and then if you were to get really lucky and have 4th, only then that's the time where you add the added lightning damage. As soon as you can hit 28, we are going to swap around a little bit, and we're going to start leveling with Cremation and Armageddon Brand. The Cremation setup is found right here. Again, remember the top to bottom priority list. If you have, for example, 1 green and 2 blue and 1 red, then you are not going to use the LMP, for example, but instead Cremation, Conk, Elemental Focus, and Cruelty. And this way it's going to be very easily adjustable for you on the fly, always depending on the stuff that you are finding currently. For the Armageddon Brand, unfortunately, you need a 4 link. Obviously, if you only have 3 gems that are linked, that are blue, that's also going to work. Again, top to bottom priority. And we're also going to use Herald of Ash, Herald of Thunder during the leveling process. And as soon as you can, you are going to use Determination, Haste, Tempest Shield, and Defiance Banner. As you can see here, again, the top to bottom priority, but on the auras, it's a little bit more complicated because obviously you cannot use Determination and Haste early on because that reserves way too much mana. So always try to mix and match these auras according to your current reservation efficiency. So if you can only use Determination and Defiance Banner as it is enabled here, that's perfectly fine. And constantly recheck. Maybe at some point you can now use Tempest Shield instead of Defiance Banner. Maybe you can also check all 3. And at some point you are going to become able to use the Haste and get rid of the others. Especially during the campaign, that is going to help you out tremendously because Haste is just that good when it comes to going fast. Make sure that your Arcane Surge stays on level 1 so you profit off of the proccing way faster. And after you are done with leveling up and you just now swap to DD, which again should only be done after checking the notes right here. There is some stuff that you need to have to be able to swap to DD. For example, you need a Detonate Dead, you need cast speed on Scepter and Amulet, and a level 17 Desecrate. And of course, you need to do the Race Spectre stuff at the beginning of the video. But as soon as you have done this, you can actually start using DD and go into your map progression. For this, it's extremely important to go through all of your currently equipped items and change to the Detonate Dead setup. For this, it's actually pretty self-explanatory. We have a 5-link DD setup, again sorted from top to bottom in priority, but we actually need to self-cast Flame Surge until we actually get exposure gloves. You can see that on the items right here. When we swap to the DD, we currently don't have gloves with exposure on, which is gonna only be available to us around the mid-game. As you can see here, inflict fire exposure on hit, applying -11 to fire resistances. As soon as you have that glove, you are actually able to not use the Flame Surge anymore, and you are going to be using that in your Arcanist brand instead of the Wave of Conviction. So until you have exposure on your gloves, you will need to use Wave of Conviction in your Arcanist brand setup and will have to self-cast your Flame Surge, especially on bosses. While you are leveling up your character, you also have leveling skill trees that are going to change according to your character's level. So 1 to 22 up until early maps, for example. And this is always going to be reflected in the skill tree here. And as soon as your character hits the end game mapping tree, we are actually making use of a chill tech for the T17 maps. Here up in the north, we are going to be using the Cold Mastery that is making every chill hit be bumped up to 10% action speed reduction. We are going to be applying a little bit of cold damage with our endgame setup. Here on the helmet, we are going to actually use the added cold damage to spells implicit so that we can then constantly chill for 10% reduced action speed on all of the targets, making it much safer in the T17 maps and also on bosses. For leveling up the character, the nodes right here are actually going to be the ones that you are allocating at last, because as you can see here, the character is 97. If you get rid of that, you're 94. But this is exactly where you are going to get the last points into, and then you can actually decide what you want to do. There is a very easy stuff you can take out of if you don't need the additional cast speed or the attributes right here. This is what you can get rid of, and also you can see down here there is also some damage that you can get rid of if you wanted to, but a very easy guide on how to see which one of these would actually be best to get later for your character is by just hovering over and then seeing the DPS loss that you would be getting if you would get this node later, for example. And if your character feels a little bit slow in terms of damage, then you would go to this node right here a little bit earlier than, for example, for the life. But if you are struggling to stay alive, then obviously you would want to go for this cluster right here. So this way you can actually mix and match the talent tree according to your current needs for the character. For the multiple skill trees, I have also set up multiple item sets here to go with your progression for the character. For example, right here, whenever you are going into early maps, this is going to be your first item set that you are going to look forward to. And very important right here, I have capitalized the stuff that is super important. If you remember in the general info section, I said you need cast speed on the one-hander in the scepter, and you also need cast speed on the Jade Amulet. This is why I have put the cast speed here in caps, because you need that ideally for the fast desecrates, so you're not going to feel super clunky. This is basically the only requirement that you have, and then I'm giving suggestions for the rest of your character. Especially useful are the heavy belts right here if you're lacking some attributes, and also the Jade Amulet can also be another attribute type depending on which attribute you need. And this way you are going to progress to the mid game, where you can actually see that we now have the required exposure gloves that I was referencing earlier, and we also have the shock on focus amethyst ring. With this enchant, you are actually going to deal a lot of damage, and it's actually not that hard to do, because when you have that enchant, you're going to get a focus on your skill bar, which you can always use on especially bosses, which is going to shock the nearby enemy, and then you can use your Val Detonate Dead for huge burst, because the shock is going to increase the damage that the nearby enemies are taking. So just use your normal combo as you are used to, but on top of that, you are going to use the focus to omega burst the bosses down and have a lot of damage available to you on demand. If you are looking at the DPS or EHP values of the build, again, it's really important that you are combining the correct stuff with each other. For example, if you're wanting to look at the endgame bossing setup, obviously you are going to use the skills for the endgame bossing together with the item set for the endgame bossing, together with the tree for the endgame bossing, and then you actually have the correct values for the build. Obviously, this is basically very well put together. It's going to take a little bit of time until you get that, but I have actually been using T3 high rolled affixes on the items, so this is not like omega juiced giga late game stuff, so there's actually room for improvement. The only thing that I sometimes have on T2 is spell suppression to actually get the 100% spell suppression cap, but don't forget that in this league actually the tattoos exist again, so getting to the spell suppression cap is gonna be much easier than we are used to from the previous league. And if you are still struggling to hit spell suppression cap, you can anoint the entrench node on your amulet, which is gonna give you much more spell suppression in an easy to access way. I'm actually looking very much forward to the new league. There's just so much new stuff to explore, and if you have any questions to this build or want to hang out while we are exploring together, I suggest you check out the Twitch that is going to be linked down in the description below. And if you like content similar to this, make sure to subscribe to this YouTube channel, and I'll see you next time.